есть город, который я вижу во сне. О, если бы знали, как дорог у черного моря открывшийся мне в цветущих акациях город. В цветущих акациях город у черного моря.
So I will start from the early 20th century. It's very important because it might be surprising, but actually in the early 20th century China, men actively initiate and advocate for women liberation. Well, sadly though, not really for women's own interests. Well, you can imagine that. And so there were two basic and very critical themes. One is to liberate women, and the other is to educate women. Why they need to liberate women? Because taking a very important example is the bond fit, because the bonded fit demonstrates barbaric and weak national image, so women were to blame for the weakness of the nation. And it's tightly tied to nationalism. And the second is to educate women, not to promote women's education and self-recognition and self-determination, but the educated women could educate their children, well, by children, basically, and especially their sons, right? And all this adds up to the modern new women image. So, like authorities by that time, well, by authority usually is men, speaks for women, and women are silenced. They are used as a weapon, a channel for nationalism and modernity. But for the women's side, of course, women do want liberation, but there are many leading features who think deeper and further on women's rights. I'll give two examples here, and they represent the more radical thoughts of that time. One is Liu Yin, and the other is He Yingzhen. He Yingzhen is like a founder of China's national feminism and women's rights. And Liu Yin, she brought up not only the liberation of women's economic status, but also the liberation of the soul of women. So women should have the self-determination and recognition of their own status and of their own condition in China and even in the world. And for He Yingzhen, she shifted the focus of women's economic conditions into the field of women's own feelings and mental demand, because by the time, actually, it was the colonial period, so lots of women actually entered the job market to work in factories and work overtime, of course. So He Yingzhen, her paper are even more revolutionary at the time because she's very reflexive and conscious of the mainstream advocacy on women liberation of the time. And she points out that what has been advocated by men is yet another form of exploration of women. Like if afterwards, like nationalism and modernity is achieved, the women is kind of like disposable by men. And so apart from this, He Yingzhen is also being super aware of the class conflict. She also makes it clear that by equal rights to women, it doesn't only mean that for the upper class, privileged women who got better resources and have more easy access to education and to the parliaments, make it to the higher ground, higher position in the government. But she advocates women to be a solidary community. So there's this sense of solidarity of women as a whole. And also, she refers a lot to Marxism, and in her later life, eventually she concludes a future lies in anarchism, which is a little bit weird, but either way, she even tries to push it beyond women's right to human right. So here, already in the early 20th century, she was thinking about, we don't only want equal to men because we can't be men. So since Mr. Xu here mentioned Xie Xuehong and the situation of women's rights movement in Taiwan on Friday, and in response to some unclear questions raised on Friday, I will fill in the blanks here. So Taiwan during the Japanese colonial period, the feminism emerged during early 1920s, and young people of that time, if they got like the money and the power, they would travel to metropolis, to mainland China, and especially to Japan to study. And also, the later May 4th movement promoted the development of women's rights in Taiwan. And about Xie Xuehong, Xie Xuehong actually she's neither the only nor the first feminist in 20th century Taiwan, but it is true that she's one of the most recognized and respected ones because she's one of the founder of Taiwan's Communist Party. But herself, she actually joined the Communist Party in 1925 in Shanghai, and there was a void of her life in 1940 to 1945. Actually, it was a time that she was released from the prison due to lung disease and opened this convenience store, Sanmeitang, and this was the most tranquil time. But after 5 years of tranquility and rest, she came back and fought for women, and you know the rest of the story. Okay, so another huge event for gender equality is Cultural Revolution, which was mentioned by Professor Mark Golan yesterday. So I will be very brief here. There's basically two very important points. One is the gender neutralization. So women become and be men. You can't really tell whether a person is man or woman by his or her outfits or like looks. And also the discourse on sex or gender-specific clothes were criticized as bourgeoisie. So again, like this time, both women's side and men are used as kind of like a channel to advocate and speak about political propaganda and all those things. And then we move to the reform and opening up, by which time is also the release of one-child policy. That's like a huge event to women, but it also raises lots of controversies because, well, it's of course disciplining women's body because you are basically asking women to only produce one child in her whole life, and if any of like accidents happens, and if you are carrying a baby girl, then it's possible then you'll go through abortion, forced abortion, and lots of such stuff. But however, the issue is more complicated than simply oppression to women, because the one-child policy actually allowed the only daughter in the family, if she survived, to get better resources to go to school, to participate in social life, and especially in the cities. So it was also the time that this policy empowered daughters, especially urban daughters. And so in the past 4 decades or so, with the advancement in economy, like more women entering job market and getting higher education, gaining access to the outside world, gender equality, feminism, liberation of sexuality have once again come to the public discussion, like after half a century of silence. And so scholars in China held 4 nationwide questionnaires from 1990s to 2000s, asking people's attitudes towards gender, sexuality, and finally come to the conclusion that the sex revolution has succeeded in China because people are checking, yes, I support gender equality in the questionnaire. Right. So, but checking the boxes on the questionnaire is easy, but fighting the bias and gender stereotypes in real life may not be that simple. So here's my project last year is basically focusing on the younger generations after the one-child policy, in order to learn about the status quo, to learn about how young people actually think about and how they perceive gender and sexuality. From last year's fall to this year's summer, I conducted interviews with Chinese international students in the US. Why I choose specifically this group is first, I was staying in the US by that time. But more importantly, this group share many unique characteristics. All my interviewees, they were studying by that time in Ivy Leagues. So you could imagine the demographic characteristics. They are all born after the one-child policy, so they are only child of family. They live in nuclear families, and they're used to metropolitan life. They have been living in big cities for their whole life. And they are good students at school, like good grades and scholarships, and they come from at least a well-off family, like upper middle class. So their family has the willingness and economic capacity to send them to abroad to study. And so you can see that they are relatively privileged, and they are of the elites, and they consider themselves to be open-minded, like, okay, great. Exclusively liberal, like aggressive and radical, revolutionary, like compared to the general public and general population. And so what do they think about women? What do they think about gender? There's this, it might be surprising that things doesn't change much after a century of struggling and fighting for gender equality and women's rights. Well, fortunately, they are good news, of course. We are like, of course, living in the 21st century after all. They all mentioned feminism at least, and mostly they recognize it's a good move, and if possible, they would like to support it, like if possible, etc. But what caught my attention is the new way to framing the stereotype of gender, especially on women. So this whole new concept of women being natural, the natural woman. So how they are going to do this? Now we cannot just explicitly say that women are, you know, like inferior to men. There are lots of things men could do, but women can't. But they're saying like, it's scientific. So they're applying science to articulate the view of gender differences. They're not saying like women can't do it. They're saying women are just different from men. There are things that men can do, women just can't. And referring to like biological, psychological, or more commonly, just like natural difference as the reason why women and men have or supposed to have different social roles. I'll give a little example here. So I was interviewed this like young female interviewee in he is like 23, and he's studying in one of the most like prestige university in the United States, and we were talking about maternity leave for both parents, so like both men and women, and he was surprised. He was saying like, okay, I can't imagine that. And he was presenting to me, and he's sitting behind the desk, and like imaginally, you know, like presenting as if like if I got like such a round belly and it blocked me from my desk, and it's bad for all three parties, bad for the mother, bad for the baby, and bad for the corporation. And he thinks that's the natural women, that's scientific. And so here comes to my point to be gender equality versus gender essentialism. It's so easy to fall into the trap of to be equal to men. But before we even talk about equality of gender, we shall recognize that gender is socially constructed. And as Nakmina was talking about, the gender order is constructed under this hierarchical evaluation and this power relationship because men already took over the higher ground. And the invisible superiority of men is already established. Standards for supposed equality on genders are based on men, compared with men, and differences and similarities of women to men are defined. Then when it comes to gender equality or women's rights, it's not really advocating the equality between genders, but women shall be equal to men. In order to be equal, or more accurately, to be equal to men, women need to be or become men. And development of science basically facilitates the process of producing like sameness and differences. And discrimination is no longer discrimination if it is based on scientific facts, be it productive, like pathological, or else. So thanks for your attention. And conclusion, I think in long run, it requires us to jump out of the box and to not always compare and compete women's rights with men's. And our goal is to reach equality not as men, but as women. Thanks, and thanks for our translations.